Hello, hello. Oh, ready to read chapter 2. I'm excited. Should probably pull it up so I can actually read it. That would be a good idea. Let's see. So, I think we left off last time. The dragon hatched and imprinted itself on Lawrence. Essentially, he took the harness, no problem. They fixed the problem food-wise. Turns out he can get by with fish all right. And last we left them, they were down below deck in their little cots, getting ready to sleep the night away. But yeah, I'm excited to read chapter 2. I've been looking forward to this. Oh, I didn't do much today, so I'm a little stiff. Oh, okay. Let one more minute go by and I'll start reading. Yeah, if chapters are super short, I might read a second chapter after that. But I don't want to. I'm going to try and keep it between like the 45-minute, hour 15 mark. If it goes a little over, that's fine. If it's a little under, I might just go ahead and read the next chapter. But we'll kind of see how it goes. Just play it by ear. But as of right now, we're just going to take care of chapter 2. But that could change. All right. I'm going to go ahead and dive into this. I actually brought water with me this time, so hopefully that helps. All right. The next morning, Lawrence woke when Temeraire proceeded to envelop himself in his cot, which turned around twice as he tried to climb down. Lawrence had to unhook it to disentangle him, and he burst out of the unwound fabric in hissing indignation. He had to be groomed and petted back into temper, like an affronted cat, and then he was at once hungry again. Fortunately, it was not very early, and the hands had met with some luck fishing, so there were still eggs for his own breakfast, the hens being spared another day, and a 40-pound toonie for the dragons. Temeraire somehow managed to devour the entire thing and then was too heavy to get back into his cot, so he simply dropped in a distended heap upon the floor and slept there. The rest of the first week passed similarly. Temeraire was asleep except when he was eating, and he ate and grew alarmingly. By the end of it, he was no longer staying below because Lawrence had grown to fear that it would become impossible to get him out of the ship. He had already grown heavier than a cart horse, and longer from tip to tail than the launch. After consideration of his future growth, they decided to shift stores to leave the ship heavier forward and place him upon the deck toward the stern as a counterbalance. So, I guess in this world, dragons grow really, really quick. The change was made just in time. Temeraire only barely managed to squeeze back out of the cabin, with his wings furled tightly, and he grew another foot in diameter overnight by Mr. Pollitt's measurements. Fortunately, when he lay astern, his bulk was not greatly in the way, and there he slept for the better part of each day, tail twitching occasionally, hardly stirring even when the hands were forced to clamber over him to do their work. At night, Lawrence slept on deck beside him, feeling it his place. As the weather held fair, it cost him no great pains. He was increasingly worried about food. The ox would have to be slaughtered in a day or so, with all the fishing they could do. At this rate of increase in his appetite, even if Temeraire proved willing to accept cured meat, he might exhaust their supplies before they reached shore. It would be very difficult, he felt, to put a dragon on short commons, and in any case, it would put the crew on edge. Though Temeraire was harnessed and might be in theory tame, even in these days a feral dragon, escaped from the breeding grounds, could and occasionally would eat a man if nothing more appetizing offered. And from the uneasy looks, no one had forgotten it. So, yeah, I could see the worry there. If you don't feed a dragon, I mean, they're going to get hungry. They're going to eat the first thing they can, and possibly a crewmate that is not imprinted on them. It might look a little tasty. When the first change in the air came midway through the second week, Lawrence felt the alteration unconsciously and woke near dawn, some hours before the rain began to fall. The lights of the Amity were nowhere to be seen. The ships had drawn apart during the night, under the increasing wind. The sky grew only a little lighter, and presently the first thick drops began to patter against the sails. Lawrence knew that he could do nothing. Riley must command now, if ever, and so Lawrence set himself to keeping Temeraire quiet and no distraction to the men. This proved difficult, for the dragon was very curious about the rain and kept spreading his wings to feel the water beating down on them. Thunder did not frighten him, nor lightning. "What makes it?" he only asked, and was disappointed when Lawrence could offer him no answer. "We could go see," he suggested, partly unfolding his wings again and taking a step toward the stern railing. Lawrence started with alarm. Temeraire had made no further attempts to fly since the first day, being more preoccupied with eating, and though they had enlarged the harness 3 times, they had never exchanged the chain for a heavier one. Now he could see the iron link straining and beginning to come open, though Temeraire was barely exerting any pull upon it. "Not now, Temeraire. We must let the others work, and watch from here," he said, gripping the nearest side strap of the harness and thrusting his left arm through it, though he realized now, too late, that his weight would no longer be an impediment. At least if they went aloft together, he might be able to persuade the dragon to come back down eventually. Or he might fall, but that thought he pushed from his mind as quickly as it came. Thankfully, Temeraire settled again, if regretfully, and returned to watching the sky. Lawrence looked about with a faint idea of calling for a stronger chain, but the crew were all occupied, and he could not interrupt. In any case, he wondered if there were any on board that would serve as more than an annoyance. He was abruptly aware that Temeraire's shoulder topped his head by nearly a foot, and that the foreleg, which had once been as delicate as a lady's wrist, was now thicker around than his thigh. Riley was shouting through the speaking trumpet to issue his orders. Lawrence did his best not to listen. He could not intervene, and it could only be unpleasant to hear an order he did not like. The men had already been through one nasty gale as a crew and knew their work. Fortunately, the wind was not contrary, so they might go scudding before the gale, and the topgallant masts had already been struck down properly. So far all was well, and they were keeping roughly on their eastern heading. But behind them, an opaque curtain of whirling rain blotted out the world, and it was outpacing the Reliant. The storm's catching up to him. The wall of water crashed upon the deck with the sound of gunfire, soaking him through to the skin immediately, despite his oilskin and sou'wester. Temeraire snorted and shook his head like a dog, sending water flying, and ducked down beneath his own hastily opened wings, which he curled about himself. Lawrence, still tucked up against the side and holding to the harness, found himself also sheltered by the living dome. It was exceedingly strange to be so snug in the heart of a raging storm. He could still see out through the places where the wings did not overlap, and a cool spray came in upon his face. "That man who brought me the shark is in the water," Temeraire said presently, and Lawrence followed his line of sight. Through the nearly solid mass of rain, he could see a blur of red and white shirt come 6 points abaft the larboard beam, and something like an arm waving. Gordon, one of the hands who had been helping with the fishing. "Man overboard," he shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth to make it carry, and pointed out to the struggling figure in the waves. Riley gave one anguished look. A few ropes were thrown, but already the man was too far back. The storm was blowing them before it, and there was no chance of retrieving him with the boats. "He is too far from the ropes," Temeraire said. "I will go and get him." Lawrence was in the air and dangling before he could object, the broken chain swinging free from Temeraire's neck beside him. He seized it with his loose arm, and it came close, and wrapped it around the straps of the harness a few times to keep it from flailing and striking Temeraire's side like a whip. Then he clung grimly and tried only to keep his head, while his legs hung over the empty air with nothing but the ocean waiting below to retrieve him if he should lose his grip. Instinct had sufficed to get him aloft, but it might not be adequate to keeping him there. Temeraire was being forced to the east of the ship. He kept trying to fight the wind head-on. There was a hideous dizzying moment where they went tumbling before the sharp gust, and Lawrence thought for an instant that they were lost and would be dashed into the waves. "With the wind," he roared, and every ounce of breath developed over 18 years at sea, hoping Temeraire could hear him. "Go with the wind, damn you!" The muscles beneath his cheeks strained, and Temeraire righted himself, turning eastwards. Abruptly, the rain stopped, beating upon Lawrence's face. They were flying with the wind, going at an enormous rate. He gasped for breath, tears whipping away from his eyes with the speed. He had to close them. It was as far beyond standing in the tops of the 10 knots as the experience was beyond standing in a field on a hot, still day. There was a reckless laughter trying to bubble out of his throat, like a boy's, and he only barely managed to stifle it and think sanely. "We cannot come straight at him," he called. You must go north, then south. Temeraire, do you understand?" If the dragon answers, the wind took the reply, but he seemed to have grasped the idea. He dropped abruptly, eagling northwards with his wings cupping the wind. Lawrence's stomach dived as a rowboat in a heavy swell. The rain and wind still battered them, but not so badly as before, and Temeraire came about and changed tacks, as sweetly as a fine cutter, zigzagging through the air and making gradual progress back in a westerly direction. Lawrence's arms were burning. He thrust his left arm through the breastband against losing his grip, and unwound his right hand to give it a respite. As they drew even with and then past the ship, he could just see Gordon still struggling in the distance. Fortunately, the man could still swim a little, and despite the fury of the rain and wind, the swell was not so great as to drag him under. Lawrence looked at Temeraire's claws dubiously. With the enormous talons, if the dragon were to snatch Gordon up, and the maneuver might as easily kill the man as save him. Lawrence would have to put himself into position to catch Gordon. "Temeraire, I will pick him up. Wait until I am ready, then go as low as you can," he called. Then he lowered himself down the harness slowly and carefully to hang down from the belly, keeping one arm hooked through the strap at every stage. It was a terrifying progress, but once he was below, matters became easier, as Temeraire's body shielded him from the rain and wind. He pulled on the broad strap which ran around Temeraire's middle. There was perhaps just enough give. One at a time, he worked his legs between the leather and Temeraire's belly, so he might have both his hands free, then slapped the dragon's side. Temeraire stooped abruptly, like a diving hawk. Lawrence let himself dangle down, trusting to the dragon's aim, and his fingers made furrows in the surface of the water for a couple of yards before they hit sodden cloth and flesh. He blindly clutched at the feel, and Gordon grabbed at him in turn. Temeraire was lifting back up and away, wings beating furiously, but thankfully they could now go with the wind instead of fighting it. Gordon's weight dragged on Lawrence's arms, shoulders, thighs, every muscle straining. The band was so tight upon his calves that he could no longer feel his legs below the knee, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of all the blood in his body rushing straight to his head. They swung heavily back and forth like a pendulum as Temeraire arrowed back towards the ship, and the world tilted crazily around him. They dropped onto the deck ungracefully, rocking the ship. Temeraire stood wavering on his hind legs, trying at the same time to fold his wings out of the wind and keep his balance with the two of them dragging him downward from the belly strap. Gordon let go and scrambled away in panic, while Temeraire seemed about to fall over upon him at any moment. His stiff fingers were a knife flashing, cutting through the strap. His legs thumped heavily to the deck, blood rushing back into them. Temeraire similarly dropped down to all fours to get in beside him, the impact sending a tremor through the deck. Lawrence lay flat on his back and panted. For the moment, not caring the rain was beating full upon him. His muscles would obey no command. Wells hesitated. Lawrence waved him back to his work and struggled back onto his legs. They held him up, and the pain of the returning sensation eased as he forced them to move. The gale was still blowing around them, but the ship was now set to rights, scudding before the wind under close reefed topsails, and there was less of a feel of crisis upon the deck. Turning away from Riley's handiwork with a sense of mingled pride and regret, Lawrence coaxed Temeraire to shift back towards the center of the stern, where his weight would not unbalance the ship. It was barely in time. As soon as Temeraire settled down once again, he yawned enormously and tucked his head down beneath his wing, ready to sleep for once without making his usual demand for food. Lawrence slowly lowered himself to the deck and leaned against the dragon's side. His body still ached profoundly from the strain. He roused himself for only a moment longer. He felt the need to speak, though his tongue felt thick and stupid with fatigue. "Temeraire," he said. "That was well done. Very bravely done." Temeraire brought his head out and gazed at him, eye slits widened to ovals. "Oh," he said, sounding a little uncertain. Lawrence realized with a brief stab of guilt that he had scarcely given the dragonet a kind word before this. The convulsion of his life might be the creature's fault, in some sense, but Temeraire was only obeying his nature, and to make the beast suffer for it was hardly noble. But he was too tired at the moment to make better amends than to repeat lamely, "Very well done," and pat the smooth black side. Yet it seemed to serve. Temeraire said nothing more, but he shifted himself a little and tentatively curled up around Lawrence, partly unfurling a wing to shield him from the rain. The fury of the storm was muffled beneath the canopy, and Lawrence could feel the great heartbeat against his cheek. He was warmed through in moments by the steady heat of the dragon's body, and thus sheltered, he slid abruptly and completely into sleep. Very nice. So just saying that's already kind of created a little bond. And I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that would be the first time he actually said anything real nice to the dragon. I mean, he's giving him food, giving him necessity. All he's really done up to this point is basically telling him, no, you can't leave. Here's food, here's fish, even though I'm sure you prefer meat or beef. So, yeah, it probably means something to Temeraire, I would assume. Alright. Are you quite sure it is secure? Riley asked anxiously. Sir, I am sure we could put together a net. Perhaps you had better not. Lawrence shifted his weight and pulled against the straps wrapped snugly around his thighs and calves. They did not give, nor did the main part of the harness, and he remained stable in his perch atop Temeraire's back, just behind the wings. No, Tom, it won't do, and you know it. This is not a fishing boat, and you cannot spare the men. We might very well meet a Frenchman one of these days, and then where will we be? He leaned forward and patted Temeraire's neck. The dragon's head was doubled back, observing the proceedings with earnest. Let me check something real quick. Okay, yeah. Are you ready? May we go now? He asked, putting a forehand on the railing. Muscles were already gathering beneath the smooth hide, and there was a palpable impatience in his voice. Stand clear, Tom, Lawrence said hastily, casting off the chain and taking hold of the neck strap. Very well. Temeraire, let us... A single leap, and they were airborne, the broad wings thrusting in great sweeping arcs to either side of him, the whole long body stretched out like an arrow driving upwards into the sky. He looked downwards over Temeraire's shoulder. Already the Reliant was shrinking to a child's toy, bobbing lonely in the vast expanse of the ocean. He could even see the Amity, perhaps 20 miles to the east. The wind was enormous, but the straps were holding, and he grinned idiotically again. He realized, unable to prevent himself. We will keep to the west, Temeraire, Lawrence called. He did not want to run the risk of getting too close to land and possibly encouraging a French patrol. They had put a band around the narrow part of Temeraire's neck beneath the head and attached reins to this, so Lawrence might more easily give Temeraire direction. Now he consulted the compass he had strapped into his palm and tugged on the right rein. The dragon pulled out of his climb and turned willingly, leveling out. The day was clear, without clouds and a moderate swell only. Temeraire's wings beat less rapidly now they were no longer going up. But even so, the pace was devouring the miles. The Reliant and the Amity were already out of sight. Oh, I see, Temeraire said, and they were plummeting down with even more speed. Lawrence gripped the reins tightly and swallowed a yell. It was absurd to feel so childishly gleeful. The distance gave him some more idea of the dragon's eyesight. It would have to be more prodigious to allow him It would have to be prodigious to allow him to sight prey at such a range. If I said that word right, prodigious. He had barely time for the thought. Then there was a tremendous splash, and Temeraire was lifting back away with with a porpoise, struggling in his claws in streaming water. Okay. Another astonishment. Temeraire stopped and hovered in place to eat, his wings beating perpendicular to his body in swiveling arcs. Lawrence had no idea that dragons could perform such a maneuver. It was not comfortable, as Temeraire's control was not very precise, and he bobbed up and down wildly, but it proved very practical, for as he scattered bits of entrails onto the ocean below, other fish began to rise to the surface to feed on the discards, and when he had finished with the porpoise, he at once snatched up 2 large tunies, one in each forehand, and ate these as well, and then had an immense swordfish, too. Having tucked his arm under the neck strap to keep himself from being flung about, Lawrence was free to look around himself and consider the sensation of being master of the entire ocean, for there was not another creature or vessel in sight. He could not help but feel pride in the success of the operation, and the thrill of flying was extraordinary. So long as he could enjoy it without thinking of all it was to cost him, he could be perfectly happy. Temeraire swallowed the last bite of swordfish and discarded the sharp upper jaw after inspecting it curiously. I am full, he said, beating back upwards into the sky. Shall we go and fly some more? It was a tempting suggestion, but they had been aloft more than an hour, and Lawrence was not yet sure of Temeraire's endurance. He regretfully said, Let us go back to the Reliant, and if you like, we may fly a bit more about her. And then racing across the ocean, low to the waves now, with Temeraire snatching at them playfully every now and again, the spray misting his face and the world rushing by in a blur. But for the constant solid presence of the dragon beneath him, he gulped deep draughts of the salt air and lost himself in simple enjoyment, only pausing every once and again to tug the reins after consulting his compass, and bringing them at last back to the Reliant. Temeraire said he was ready to sleep again after all, so they made a landing. This time it was a more graceful affair, and the ship did not bounce so much as settle slightly lower into the water. Lawrence unstrapped his legs and climbed down, surprised to find himself a little saddle sore. But he at once realized that this was only to be expected. Riley was hurrying back to meet him, relief written clearly on his face, and Lawrence nodded at him reassuringly. "No need to worry. He did splendidly, and I think you need not worry about his meals in the future. We will manage very well," he said, stroking the dragon's side. Temeraire, already drowsing, opened one eye and made a pleased rumbling noise, then closed it again. "I'm very glad to hear it," Riley said, "and not least because that means our dinner for you tonight will be respectable. We took the precaution of continuing our efforts in your absence, and we have a very fine turbot, which we may now keep for ourselves. With your consent, perhaps, I will invite some members of the gunroom to join us." "With all my heart, I look forward to it," Lawrence said. Stretching to relieve his stiffness in his legs, he had insisted on surrendering the main cabin once Temeraire had been shifted to the deck. Riley had at last acquiesced. I don't know. But he compensated for his guilt at displacing his former captain by inviting Lawrence to dine with him virtually every night. This practice had been interrupted by the gale, but that having blown itself out the night before, they meant to resume this evening. It was a good meal and a merry one, particularly once the bottle had gone round a few times and the younger midshipmen had drunk enough to lose their wooden manners. Lawrence had the happy gift of easy conversation, and his table had always been a cheerful place for his officers. To help matters along further, he and Riley were fast approaching a true friendship now that the barrier of rank had been removed. The gathering thus had an almost informal flavor to it, so that when Carver found himself the only one at liberty. Let me take a breather for a second. I think I'm trying to read too fast, and I'm stumbling over my own words here. I'll start that little paragraph over. I'm drink some water. Okay, let's try that again. The gathering thus had an almost informal flavor to it, so that when Carver found himself the only one at liberty, having devoured his pudding a little more quickly than his elders, he dared to address Lawrence directly, and tentatively said, "Sir, if I may be so bold as to ask, is it true that dragons can breathe fire?" Lawrence, pleasantly full of plum duff topped by several glasses of fine Riesling, received the question tolerantly. "That depends on the breed, Mr. Carver," he answered, putting down his glass. "However, I think the ability extremely rare. I have only ever seen it once myself, in a Turkish dragon at the Battle of the Nile, and I was damned glad the Turks had taken our part when I saw it work, I can tell you." The other officers shuddered all around and nodded. Few things were as deadly to a ship as uncontrolled fire upon your deck. "I was on the Goliath myself," Lawrence went on. "We were not half a mile distant from the Orient when she went up like a torch. We had shot out her deck guns and mostly cleared her sharpshooters from the tops, so the dragon could strafe her at will." He fell silent, remembering the sails all ablaze and trailing thick plumes of black smoke, the great orange and black beast diving down and pouring still more fire from its jaws upon them, its wings fanning the flames, the terrible roaring which was only drowned out by at last by the explosion, and the way all sound had been muted for nearly a day thereafter. He had been in Rome once as a boy, and there seen in the Vatican a painting of hell by Michelangelo, with dragons roasting the damned souls of fire. It had been very like. There was a general moment of silence, imagination drawing the scene for those who had not been present. Mr. Pollock cleared his throat and said, "Fortunately, I believe that the ability to spit poison is more common among them, or acid. Not that those are not formidable weapons in their own right." "Lord, yes," Wells said to this. "I have seen dragon spray eat away an entire mainsail in under a minute. But still, it will not set fire to a magazine and make your ship burst into flinders around under you." "Will Temeraire be able to do that?" Battersea asked, a little round-eyed at the stories. And Lawrence started. He was sitting at Riley's right hand, just as if he had been invited to the gunroom for dinner. And for a moment, he had almost forgotten that instead he was a guest in his former cabin and upon his former ship. Fortunately, Mr. Pollitt answered, so Lawrence could take a moment to cover his confusion. As his breed is not one of those described in my books, we must wait for the answer until we reach land and can have him properly identified. Even if he is of the appropriate kind, most likely there will be no manifestation of such an ability until he has full growth, which will not be for some months to come. "Thank heavens," Riley said, to a general round of laughing agreement, and Lawrence managed to smile and raise a glass in Temeraire's honor with the rest of the table. Afterwards, having said his good nights in the cabin, Lawrence walked a little unsteadily back towards the stern, where Temeraire lay in solitary splendor, the crew having mostly abandoned that part of the deck to him as he had grown. He opened a gleaming eye as Lawrence approached him and lifted a wing in invitation. Lawrence was a little more surprised at the gesture, but he took up his pallet and ducked under into a comfortable warmth. He unrolled the pallet and sat down upon it, leaning back against the dragon's side, and Temeraire lowered her wing again, making a warm, sheltered space around him. "Do you think I will be able to breathe fire or spit poison?" Temeraire asked. "I'm not sure how I could tell. I tried, but I only blew air." "Did you hear us talking?" Lawrence asked, startled. The stern windows had been open, and the conversation might well have been audible on deck, but somehow it had not occurred to him that Temeraire might listen. "Yes," Temeraire said. "The part about the battle is very exciting. Have you been in many of them?" "Oh, I suppose so," Lawrence said. "Not more than many other fellows." This was not entirely true. He had an unusually large number of actions to his credit, which had seen him to the post list at a relatively young age, and he was accounted a fighting captain. "But that is how we found you. When you were in the egg, you were aboard the prize when we took her," he added, indicating the Amity, her stern lanterns presently visible to 2 points on to larboard. Temeraire looked out at her west with interest. "You won me in a battle? I did not know that." He sounded pleased by the information. "Will we be in another one soon? I would like to see. I am sure I could help, even if I cannot breathe fire yet." Lawrence smiled at his enthusiasm. Dragons notoriously had a great deal of fighting spirit, part of what made them so valuable in war. Most likely not before we put in port, but I dare say we will see enough of them after. England does not have many dragons, so we will most likely be called on in a great deal once you are grown," he said. He looked up at Temeraire's head, presently raised up to gaze out to sea, relieved of the pressing concern of feeding him. Lawrence could give thought now to the other meanings of all that strength behind his back. Temeraire was already larger than some full-grown dragons of their other breeds, and in his inexperienced judgment, very fast. He would indeed be invaluable to the Corps, and to England, fire breath or no. It was not without pride that he thought to himself there was no fear Temeraire would ever prove shy. If he had a difficult duty ahead of him, he could hardly have asked for a worthier partner. "Will you tell me some more of the Battle of the Nile?" Temeraire said, looking down. "Was it just your ship and the other one and the dragon?" "Lord, no. There were 13 ships of the line for our side, with 8 dragons from the 3rd Division of the Aerial Corps in support, and another 4 dragons from the Turks," Lawrence said. "The French had 17 and 14 for their part, so we were outnumbered, but Admiral Nelson's strategy left them wholly taken aback." And as he continued, Temeraire lowered his head and curled more closely about him, listening with his great eyes shining in the darkness, and so they talked quietly together long into the night. Maybe I will go on to chapter 3. Let me pull ahead a little bit. Let's see. Ooh, it's a long chapter. I might just have to make... I wasn't expecting that chapter to be so short. Oh, it closed. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'll get that opened back up. Let's see. Alright. Where'd it go? Why is it not showing it? Oh, there it is. Open with. Wasn't this far? Ah, dang it. This app keeps crashing. Give me a moment, I'll try and get this figured out. It's on chapter 18, so why is it? Or page 18, I don't think. Oh, no, I was even farther. Okay. Okay. Let's get rid of that. See Minotaur, and I gotta recapture it, re-screen capture it. For some reason, it like gets rid of it. And here we go. I think that's good. Well, I'm just going to start reading and see how long it takes. If it goes too long, I might have to cut it in the middle of the chapter, but we'll see. But I'm just going to continue on after another drink of water. All right. Chapter 3. They arrived at Funchal a day short of Lawrence's original 3-week estimate, having been sped along their way by the gale, with Temeraire sitting up in the stern and eagerly watching from the moment the island came into view. He caused something of an immediate sensation on land. Dragons not ordinarily to be seen riding into harbor upon small frigates, and there was a small crowd of spectators gathered upon the docks as they come into port, although by no means coming very close to the vessel. Admiral Croft's flagship was in port. The Reliant was normally sailing under his command, and Riley and Lawrence had privately agreed that the two of them should report together to acquaint him with the unusual situation. The signal captain report aboard flag went up on the Commendable almost the instant they had dropped anchor, and Lawrence paused for only a moment to speak with Temeraire. "You must remain aboard until I return. Remember," he said anxiously, for while Temeraire was never willfully disobliging, he was easily distracted by anything new and of interest, and Lawrence did not have a great deal of confidence in his restraint while surrounded by so much of a new world to explore. "I promise you we shall fly over the whole island when I come back. You shall see all you like, and in the meantime, Mr. Wells will bring you a nice fresh veal and some lamb, which you have never had." Temeraire sighed a little, but inclined his head. "Very well, but do hurry," he said. "I would like to go up to those mountains, and I could just eat those," he added, looking at a team of carriage horses standing nearby. The horses stamped nervously as though they had heard and understood perfectly well. "Oh no, Temeraire, you cannot just eat anything you see on the streets," Lawrence said in alarm. "Wells, Wells will bring you something straight away." Turning, he caught the third lieutenant's eye and conveyed the urgency of the situation. Then the final dubious glance, he went down the gangplank and joined Riley. Admiral Croft was waiting for them impatiently. He had evidently heard something of a fuss. He was a tall man and a striking one. The more so for a raking scar across his face and the false hand which was attached to the stump upon his left arm. Its iron fingers operated by springs and catches. He had lost the limb shortly before his promotion to the flag rank, and since had put on a great deal of weight. He did not rise when they came into the stateroom, but only scowled a little and waved them to the chairs. "Very well, Lawrence, explain yourself. I suppose this has something to do with the Ferrol you have down there." "Sir, that is Temeraire. He is not Ferrol." Lawrence said. "We took a French ship, the Amity, 3 weeks ago yesterday. We found his egg in her hold. Our surgeon had some knowledge of dragonkind. He warned us that it would hatch shortly, and so we were able to arrange, that is to say, I harnessed him." Croft sat up and abruptly and squinted at Lawrence, then at Riley, only then taking notice of the change in uniform. "What, yourself? And so you, good Lord, why didn't you put one of your midshipmen to the thing?" he demanded. "This is taking duty a little far, Lawrence. A fine thing when a naval officer chooses to jump ship for the Corps." "Sir, my officers and I drew lots," Lawrence said, suppressing a flare of indignation. He had not desired to be lauded for his sacrifice, but it was a little much to be upbraided for it. "I hoped no one would ever question my devotion to the service. I felt it only fair to them that I should share the risk. And in the event, though I did not draw the lot, there was no avoiding it. He took a liking to me, and we could not risk him refusing the harness from another hand." "Oh, hell," Croft said, and relapsed in his chair with a sullen expression, tapping his fingers of his right hand against the metal palm of his left, a nervous gesture, and sat silently except for the small clinking noise which his fingernails made upon the iron. The minutes dragged, while Lawrence alternated between imagining a thousand disasters which Temeraire might precipitate in his absence and worrying about what Croft might do with the Reliant and Riley. At last Croft started, as if waking up, and waved his good hand. "Well, there must be some sort of bounty. They can hardly give less for a harness creature than a feral one, after all," he said. "The French frigate, a man of war, I suppose. No merchantman? Well, she looks likely enough. I am sure she will be brought into the service," he added. Good humor apparently restored, and Lawrence realized with mingled relief and irritation that the man had only been calculating his admiral's share in his hand. "Indeed, sir, she is very trim craft. 36 guns, he said politely, keeping several other things which he might have said to himself. He would never have to report to this man again, but Riley's future still hung in the balance. You have done as you ought, Lawrence, I am sure, though it is a pity to lose you. I suppose you shall like to be an aviator," Croft said, in tones that made it quite plain he supposed no such thing. "We have no division of the Corps locally, though. Even the dispatch carrier only comes through once a week. You will have to take him to Gibraltar, I imagine." "Yes, sir, though the trip must wait until he has more growth. He can stay aloft for an hour or so without much trouble, but I do not like the risk of him on a long flight just yet," Lawrence said firmly. "And in the meantime, he must be fed. We have only managed to get by so long with fishing, but of course he cannot hunt here." "Well, Lawrence, that is no lookout of the navies, I am sure," Croft said. But before Lawrence could be really taken aback by this petty remark, the man seemed to realize how ill it sounded and amended his words. "However, I will speak to the governor. I am sure we can arrange something. Now then, the Reliant, and of course the Amity. We must take some thought for them. I should like to point out that Mr. Riley has been in command of the Reliant since the harnessing, and that he has handled her exceptionally well, bringing her safely to port through a two-day gale," Lawrence said. "He fought very bravely in the action, which won us the prize as well." "Oh, I'm sure," Croft said, turning his fingers in circles again. "Who do you have in the Amity?" "My First Lieutenant Gibbs," Lawrence said. "Yes, of course," Croft said. "Well, it is a bit much of you to hope to make both your first and second lieutenants post in such a way. Lawrence, you must see that. There are not so many fine frigates out there." Lawrence had great difficulty in keeping his countenance. The man was clearly looking for some excuse to give himself a plum to deal out to one of his own favorites. "Sir," he said icily. I think that's icily. "Sir," he said icily, "I do not quite take your meaning. I hope you are not suggesting that I had myself put in harness in order to open a vacancy. I assure you, my only motive was to secure to England a very valuable dragon, and I would hope that their lordships will see it in such a way." It was as close as he would come to harping on his own sacrifice, and a good deal closer than he would have preferred to come, without Riley's welfare at stake. Excuse me. But it had its effect. Croft seemed struck by the reminder, and the mention of the Admiralty. At least he hemmed and hawed and retreated, and dismissed them without saying anything final about removing Riley from command. Sir, I am deeply indebted to you, Riley said, as they walked together back towards the ship. I only hope you will not have caused difficulties for yourself by pressing the matter so. I suppose you must have a great deal of influence. Lawrence at the moment had little room for any emotion but relief, for they had come to their own dock, and Temeraire was still sitting on the deck of the ship. That's all he could think about right now. Although that looked more like an abattoir at the moment, and the area around his chops more red than black. The crowd of spectators had entirely dispersed. If there is any blessing to the whole business, Tom, it is that I no longer need to give much thought to influence. I do not suppose it can make any difference to an aviator, he answered. Pray have no concern for me. Should you mind if we were to walk a little faster? I think he has finished eating. Flying did a great deal more to soothe his ruffled temper. It was impossible to be angry with the whole island of Madeira spread out before him, and the wind in his hair, and Temeraire excitingly pointing out new things of interest, such as animals, houses, carts, trees, rocks, and anything else which might catch his eye. He had lately worked out a method of flying with his head partly turned around, so that he might talk to Lawrence even while they flew. By mutual agreement, he perched at last upon an empty road that ran along the edge of the deep valley. A bank of clouds was rolling thickly down the green southern slopes, clinging to the ground in a peculiar way, and he sat to watch their movement in fascination. Let me get some more water. Whew. I gotta slow down. All right. We're gonna leave off. Lawrence dismounted. He was still growing used to riding and was glad to stretch his legs after an hour in the air. He walked about for a while now, enjoying the view, and thought to himself that the next morning he would bring something to eat and drink on their flight. He would rather have liked a sandwich and a glass of wine. I would like another one of those lambs, Temeraire said, echoing his own thoughts. They were very tasty. Can I eat those over there? They look even larger. There was a handsome flock of sheep grazing placidly on the far side of the valley, white against the green. No, Temeraire, those are sheep. Mutton, Lawrence said. They are not as good, but I think they must be someone's property, so we cannot go snatching them. But perhaps I will see if I cannot arrange for a shepherd to set one aside for you tomorrow, if you would like to come back here. It seems very strange that the ocean is full of things that one can eat as one likes, and on land, everything seems to be spoken for, Temeraire said, disappointed. It does not seem quite right. They are not eating those sheep themselves, after all, and I am hungry now. That's a fair point. At this rate, I suppose I shall be arrested for teaching you seditious thinking, Lawrence said, amused. You sound positively revolutionary. Only think, perhaps the fellow who owns those is the same one we will ask to give us a nice lamb for your dinner tonight. He will hardly do so if we steal a sheep. I would rather have a nice lamb now, Temeraire muttered. But he did not go after one of the sheep, and instead returned to examining the clouds. May we go over to those clouds? I would like to see why they are moving like that. My throat is just like, I don't know, weird. Lawrence looked at the shrouded hillside dubiously, but he more and more disliked telling the dragon no when he did not have to. It was so often necessary. We may try it if you like, he said, but it seems a little risky. We could easily run up against the mountainside and be brought by the lee. Oh, I will land below them, and then we may walk up, Temeraire said, crouching low and putting his neck to the ground so Lawrence could scramble back aboard. That will be more interesting in any case. It was a little odd to go walking with a dragon, and very odd to outdistance one. Temeraire might have one step to every 10 paces of Lawrence's, but he took them very rarely, being more occupied in looking back and forth to compare the degree of cloud cover upon the ground. Lawrence finally walked some distance ahead and threw himself down upon the slope to wait. Even under the heavy fog, he was comfortable, thanks to the heavy clothing and oilskin cloak which he had learned from experience to wear while flying. Temeraire continued to creep very slowly up the hill, interrupting his studies of the clouds now and again to look at a flower or a pebble. To Lawrence's surprise, he paused at one point and dug a small rock out of the ground, which he then brought up to Lawrence with apparent excitement. pushing it along with the tip of his talon, as it was too small for him to pick up with his claws. Lawrence hefted the thing, which was about the size of his fist. It certainly was curious. Pyrite intergrown with quartz, crystal, and rock. "How did you come to see it?" he said with interest, turning it over in his hands and brushing away more of the dirt. "A little of it was out of the ground, and it was shining," Temeraire said. "Is that gold? I like the look of it." "No, it is just pyrite, but it is very pretty, is it not?" "I suppose you are one of those hoarding creatures," Lawrence said, looking affectionately up at Temeraire. "Many dragons have an inborn fascination with jewels or precious metals. I am afraid I am not rich enough to a partner for you. I will not be able to give you a heap of gold to sleep on." 1 second again. Try to walk away and cough so it's not so loud. Let's see. "I should rather have you than a heap of gold, even if it were very comfortable to sleep on," Temeraire said. "I do not mind the deck." He said it quite normally, not in the least as though he meant to deliver a compliment, and immediately went back to looking at his clouds. Lawrence was left gazing after him in a sensation of mingled amazement and extraordinary pleasure. He could scarcely imagine a similar feeling. The only parallel he could conceive from his old life would be if the Reliant had spoken to say she'd like to have him for her captain. Both praise and affection from the highest source imaginable, and it filled him with fresh determination to prove worthy of an encomium. "I am afraid I cannot help you, sir," the old fellow said, scratching behind his ear as he straightened up from the heavy volume before him. "I have a dozen books of draconic breeds, and I cannot find him in any of them. Perhaps his coloration will change when he gets older?" Lawrence frowned. This was the third naturalist he had consulted over the past week since landing in Madeira, and none of them had been able to give him any help whatsoever in determining Temeraire's breed. However, the bookseller went on, "I can give you some hope. Sir Edward Howe of the Royal Society is here on the island, taking the waters. He came by my shop last week. I believe he is staying in Porto Moniz." So I think some of these places are like actually based on real places, so if I'm saying them wrong, I apologize. "I believe he is staying in Porto Moniz, at the northwestern end of the island, and I am sure he will be able to identify your dragon for you. He has written several monographs on rare breeds from the Americas and the Orient. "Thank you very much indeed. I am glad to hear it," Lawrence said, brightening at the news. The name was familiar to him, and he had met the man in London once or twice, so that he need not even scramble for an introduction. He went back out into the street in good humor, with a fine map of the island and a book in mineralogy for Temeraire. The day was particularly fine, and the dragon was presently sprawled out in the field which had been set aside for him some distance outside the city, sunning himself after a large meal. The governor had been more accommodating than Admiral Croft, perhaps due to the anxiety of his populace over the presence of a frequently hungry dragon in the middle of their port, and had opened the public treasury to provide Temeraire with a steady supply of sheep and cattle. Temeraire was not at all unhappy with the change in his diet, and he was continuing to grow. He would no longer have fit on the Reliant stern, and he was bidding fair and become longer than the ship itself. Lawrence had taken a cottage beside the field, a small expense due to its owner's sudden eagerness to be nowhere nearby, and the two of them were managing quite happily. He regretted his own final removal from the ship's life when he had time to think of it, but keeping Temeraire exercised was a great deal of work, and he could always go into town for his dinner. He often met Riley or some of his other officers too. He had some other naval acquaintances in the town, and so he rarely passed a solitary evening. The nights were comfortable as well, even though he was obliged to return to the cottage early due to the distance. He had found a local servant for Nao, who, although wholly unsmiling and taciturn, was not disturbed by the dragon and could prepare a reasonable breakfast and supper. Temeraire generally slept during the heat of the day while he was gone, and woke again after the sun set. After supper, Lawrence would go to sit outside and read to him by the light of a lantern. He had never been much of a reader himself, but Temeraire's pleasure in books was so great as to be infectious, and Lawrence could not but think with satisfaction of the dragon's likely delight in the new book, which spoke in great detail about gemstones and their mining, despite his own complete lack of interest in the subject. It was not the sort of life which he had ever expected to lead, but so far, at least, he had not suffered in any material way from this change of status, and Temeraire was developing into uncommonly good company. More water. Whew, I'm sorry. Lawrence stopped in a coffee house and wrote Sir Edward a quick note with his direction, briefly explaining his circumstances and asking permission to call. This he addressed to Portomenes, then sent off with the establishment's postboy, adding a half-crown to speed it along. He could have flown across the island much more quickly, of course, but he did not feel he could simply descend upon someone with no warning with the dragon in tow. He could wait. He still had at least a week of liberty left to him before a reply would come from Gibraltar with instructions on how to report for duty. But the dispatch rider was due tomorrow, and the thought recalled him to an omitted duty. He had not yet written to his father. He could not let his parents learn of his altered circumstances from some second-hand account, or in the Gazette notice, which should surely be printed. And with a sense of reluctant obligation, he settled himself back down with a fresh pot of coffee to write the necessary letter. It was difficult to think what to say. Lord Allendale was not a particularly fond parent, and was punctilious in his manners. The army and navy he thought barely acceptable alternatives to the church for an impoverished younger son. He would no more have considered sending a son to the corps than to a trade, and he would certainly neither sympathize nor approve. Lawrence was well aware that he and his father disagreed on the score of duty. His father would certainly tell him it had been his duty to his name to stay well away from the dragon, and to leave some misguided idea of service out of the matter. His mother's reaction he dreaded more, for she had real affection for him, and the news would make her unhappy for his sake. Then, also, she was friendly with Lady Gallman, and what he wrote would certainly reach Edith's ears. But he could not write in such terms as might reassure either of them without provoking his father extremely. And so he contented himself with a stilted, formal note that laid out the facts without embellishment, and avoided all appearance of complaint. It would have to do. Still, he sealed it with a sense of dissatisfaction before carrying it to the dispatch post by hand. This unpleasant task completed, he turned back for the hotel in which he had taken a room. He had invited Riley and Gibbs along with several other acquaintances to join him for dinner. In recompense of earlier hospitality from them, it was not yet 2:00 and the shops were still open. He looked in the windows as he walked to distract himself from brooding upon the likely reaction of his family and nearest friends, and paused outside a small pawnbroker's. The golden chain was absurdly heavy, the sort of thing no woman could wear, and too gaudy for a man. Thick square links with flat discs and small pearl drops hanging from them alternated, but for the metal and gems alone he imagined it must be expensive. Most likely far more than he should spend, for he was being cautious with his funds now that he had no future prospect of prize money. He stepped inside anyway and inquired. It was indeed too dear. "However, sir, perhaps this one would do," the proprietor suggests, offering a different chain. It looked very much the same, only with no discs, and perhaps slightly thinner in links. It was nearly half the price of the first, still expensive, but he took it, and then felt a little silly for it. He gave it to Temeraire that night anyway, and was a little surprised at the happiness with which it was received. Temeraire clutched the chain and would not put it aside. He brooded over it in the candlelight while Lawrence read to him, and turned it this way and that to admire the light upon the gold and the pearls. When he slept at last, it remained entwined in his talons, and the next day Lawrence obliged to attach it securely to the harness before Temeraire would consent to fly. The curious reaction made him even more glad to find an enthusiastic invitation from Sir Edward awaiting him when they returned from the morning flight. For Nao brought the note out to him in the field when they landed, and Lawrence read it aloud to Temeraire. The gentleman would receive them whenever they liked to come, and he could be found at the seashore near the bathing pools. I am not tired, Temeraire said. He was curious to know his breed as Lawrence. We may go at once, if you like. He had indeed been developing more and more endurance. Lawrence decided they could easily stop and rest if needed, and climbed back aboard without even having shifted his clothing. Temeraire put out an unusual effort, and the island whipped by in a great sweep of his wings, Lawrence crouching low to his neck and squinting against the wind. They spiraled down to the shore less than an hour after lifting away, scattering bathers and seashore vendors as they landed upon the rocky shore. Lawrence gazed after them in dismay for a moment, then frowned. If they were foolish enough to imagine that a properly harnessed dragon would hurt them, it was hardly his fault, and he patted Temeraire's neck as he unstrapped himself and slid down. I will go and see if I can find Sir Edward. Stay here. I will, said Temeraire absently. He was already peering with interest into the deep rocky pools about the shore, which had odd stone outcroppings and very clear water. Sir Edward did not prove very difficult to find. He had noticed the fleeing crowd and was already approaching, the only person in view, by the time Lawrence had gone a quarter of a mile. They shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, but both of them were impatient to come to the real matter at hand, and Sir Edward assented eagerly as soon as Lawrence ventured to suggest they should walk back to Temeraire. A most unusual and charming name, Sir Edward said as they walked unconsciously, making Lawrence's heart sink. Most often they are given Roman names, extravagant ones, but then most aviators go into harness a great deal younger than you and have a tendency to puff themselves up. There is something quite absurd about a 2-ton Winchester called Imperatorius. Why? Lawrence, however did you teach him to swim? Startled, Lawrence looked and then started. Startled, Lawrence looked, then stared. In his absence, Temeraire had gone into the water and was now paddling himself about. Lord, no, I have never seen him do that before, he said. How can he not be sinking? Temeraire, do come out of the water, he called, a little anxious. Sir Edward watched with interest as Temeraire swam towards them and climbed back up on the shore. How extraordinary! The internal air sacs which permit them to fly would, I imagine, make a dragon naturally buoyant, and having grown up on the ocean as he has, perhaps he would have no natural fear of the element. This mention of air sacs was a piece of new information to Lawrence, but the dragon was joining them. So he saved the further questions that immediately sprang to mind. Temeraire, this is Sir Edward Howe, Lawrence said. Hello, said Temeraire, peering down with interest equal to that with which he was observed. I am very pleased to meet you. Can you tell me what breed I am? Sir Edward did not seem nonplussed by this direct approach, and he made a bow in reply. I hope I will be able to give you some information, indeed. May I ask you to be so kind as to move some distance up the shore, perhaps by that tree which you see over there, and spread your wings so that we may better see your full conformation. Temeraire went willingly, and Sir Edward observed his motion. Very odd, not characteristic at all. The way he holds his tail. Lawrence, you say his egg was found in Brazil? As to that, I cannot properly tell you, I'm afraid, Lawrence said, studying Temeraire's tail. He could see nothing unusual, but of course he had no real basis for comparison. Temeraire carried his tail off the ground, and it lashed the air gently as he walked. We took him from a French prize, and she was most recently come from Rio. Judging by the markings on some of her water casks, but more than that I cannot say. The logs were thrown overboard as we took her, and the captain very naturally refused to give us any information about where the egg was discovered. But I assume it could not have come from much farther, due to the length of the journey. Oh, that is by no means certain, Sir Edward said. There are some subspecies which mature in shell for upon upwards of 10 years, and 20 months is a common average. Good Lord. Temeraire had just spread out his wings. They were still dripping water. Yes? Lawrence asked hopefully. Lawrence, my God, those wings, Sir Edward cried, and literally ran across the shore towards Temeraire. Lawrence blinked and went after him, and caught up to him only by the dragon's side. I looked away for a second. There we go. Sir Edward was gently stroking one of the 6 spines that divided the sections of Temeraire's wings, gazing at it with greedy passion. Temeraire had cranked his head about to watch, but was keeping otherwise still, and did not seem to mind having his wings handled. Do you recognize him, then? Lawrence asked Sir Edward tentatively. The man looked quite overwhelmed. Recognized? Not, I assure you, in the sense of ever having seen his kind before. There can scarcely be 3 living men in Europe who have. And on the strength of this one glance, I am already furnished with enough material for an address to the Royal Society, Sir Edward answered. But the wings are irrefutable, and the number of talons? He is a Chinese imperial, although of which line I certainly cannot tell you. Oh, Lawrence, what a prize! Lawrence gazed at his wings, bemused. It had not occurred to him before that the fan-like divisions were unusual, nor the 5 talons which Temeraire had upon each foot. An imperial, he said, with uncertain smile. He wondered for a moment if Sir Edward was practicing a joke on him. The Chinese had been breeding dragons for thousands of years before the Romans had ever domesticated the wild breeds of Europe. They were violently jealous of their work, and rarely permitted even grown specimens of minor breeds to leave the country. It was absurd to think that the French had been trundling an imperial egg across the Atlantic in a 36-gun frigate. Is that a good breed? Temeraire asked. Will it be able to breathe fire? Is that a good breed? Temeraire asked. Will I be able to breathe fire? Dear creature, the very best of all possible breeds. Only the Celestials are more rare or valuable. And were you one of those? I suppose the Chinese would go to war over our having put you into a harness. So we must be glad you're not, Sir Edward said. But though I will not rule it out entirely, I think it unlikely you will be able to breathe fire. The Chinese breed first for intelligence and grace. They have such overwhelming air superiority, they do not need to seek such abilities in their lines. Japanese dragons are far more likely among the Oriental breeds to have any special offensive capabilities. Oh, said Temeraire glumly. Temeraire, do not be absurd. It is the most famous news anyone can imagine, Lawrence said, beginning to believe at last this was too far to carry a joke. You were quite certain, sir? He could not help asking. Oh, yes, Sir Edward said, returning to his examination of the wings. Only look at the delicacy of the membrane, the consistency of the color throughout the body, and the coordination between the color of the eyes and the markings. I should have seen he was a Chinese breed at once. It is quite impossible that he should have come from the wild, and no European or Incan breeder is capable of such work. And, he added, this explains the swimming as well. Chinese beasts often have an affinity for water, if I recall correctly. An imperial, Lawrence murmured, stroking Temeraire's side in wonder. It is incredible. They ought to have convoyed him with half their fleet, or sent a handler to him rather than a reverse. Perhaps they did not know what they had, Sir Edward said. Chinese eggs are notoriously difficult to categorize by appearance, other than having the texture of fine porcelain. I do not suppose, by the way, that you have any of the eggshell preserved, he asked wistfully. Not I, but perhaps some of the hands may have saved a bit, Lawrence said. I would be happy to make an inquiry for you. I am deeply indebted to you. Not at all. The debt is entirely on my side. To think that I have seen an imperial, and spoken with one. He bowed to Temeraire. In that, I may be unique among Englishmen, although Le Comte de la Pérouse wrote in his journals of having spoken with one in Korea, in the palace of their king. I would like to read that, Temeraire said. Lawrence, can you get a copy? I will certainly try, Lawrence said. And, sir, I would be very grateful if you could recommend some text to my attention. I would be glad of any knowledge of the habits and behaviors of the breed. Well, there are precious few resources, I am afraid. You will shortly be more of an expert than any other European, I imagine, Sir Edward said. But I will certainly give you a list, and I have several texts I would be happy to lend you, including the journals of Le Pérouse. If Temeraire does not mind waiting here, perhaps we can walk back to my hotel and retrieve them. I am afraid he would not fit very comfortably in my village, or in the village. I do not mind at all. I will go swimming again, Temeraire said. Having taken tea with Sir Edward and collected a number of books from him, Lawrence found a shepherd in the village willing to take his money, and he could feed Temeraire before their return journey. He was forced to drag the sheep down to the shore himself, however, with the animal bleating wildly and trying to get away long before Temeraire even came into view. Lawrence ended up having to carry it bodily, and it took its final revenge by defecating upon him before it flung it down at last in front of the eager dragon. While Temeraire feasted, he stripped to the skin and scrubbed his clothing as best he could in the water, then left the wet things on a sunny rock to dry while the two of them bathed together. Lawrence was not particularly good at swimming himself, but with Temeraire to hold on to, he could risk the deeper water where the dragon could swim. Temeraire's delight in the water was infectious, and in the end Lawrence too succumbed to playfulness, splashing the dragon and plunging under the water to come up on the other side. The water was beautifully warm, and there were many outcroppings of rock to crawl out upon for rest, some large enough for both of them. When he at last led Temeraire back onto the shore, several hours had gone by, and the sun was sinking rapidly. He was guiltily glad the other bathers had stayed away. He would have been ashamed of being seen frolicking like a boy. The sun was warm on their backs as they winged across the island back to Funchal, both of them brimming with satisfaction. With the precious books wrapped in oilskin and strapped to the harness. "I will read to you from the journals tonight," Lawrence was saying, when he was interrupted by a loud, bugling call ahead of him. Temeraire was so startled he stopped in midair, hovering for a moment. Then he roared back, a strange, tentative sound. He launched himself forwards again, and in a moment Lawrence saw the source of the call. A pale gray dragon with mottled white markings upon its belly and white striations across its wings, almost invisible against the cloud cover. It was a great distance above them. It swooped down very quickly and drew alongside them. He could see that it was smaller than Temeraire, even at his present size, but it could glide along on a single beat of its wings for much longer. Its rider was wearing gray leather that matched its hide, and a heavy hood. He unhooked several clasps on this and pushed it to hang back off his head. "Captain James, on Volatilis, dispatch service," he said, staring at Lawrence in open curiosity. Will the water break again? All right. Lawrence hesitated. A response was obviously called for, but he was not quite sure how to style himself, for he had not yet been formally discharged from the Navy, nor formally inducted in the Corps. "Captain Lawrence of His Majesty's Navy," he said finally. "On Temeraire. I am at present unassigned. Are you headed to Funchal?" "Navy? Yes, I am, and I expect you had better be as well." After that introduction, James said. He had a pleasant-looking long face, but Lawrence's reply had marred it by a deep frown. "How old is that dragonette, and where did you get him?" "I am 3 weeks and 5 days out of the shell, and Lawrence won me in battle," Temeraire said before Lawrence could reply. "How did you meet James?" he asked, addressing the other dragon. Volatilis blinked largely milky blue eyes and said in a bright voice, "I was hatched from an egg." "Oh," said Temeraire uncertainly, and turned his head around to Lawrence with a startled look. Lawrence shook his head quickly to keep him silent. "Sir, if you have questions, they can be best answered on the ground," he said to James, a little coldly. There had been a peremptory quality he did not like in the other man's tone. "Temeraire and I are staying just outside the town. Do you care to accompany us, or shall we follow you to your landing grounds?" James had been looking with surprise at Temeraire, and he answered Lawrence with a little more warmth. "Oh, let us go to yours. The moment I set down officially, I will be mobbed with people wanting to send parcels. We will not be able to talk." "Yeah. Very well. It is a field to the southwest of the city," Lawrence said. "Temeraire, pray take the lead." The gray dragon had no difficulty keeping up, though Lawrence thought Temeraire was secretly trying to pull away. Volatilis had clearly been bred, and bred successfully, for speed. English breeders were gifted at working with their limited stocks to achieve specific results, but evidently intelligence had been sacrificed in the process of achieving this particular one. They landed together to the anxious lowing of the cattle and had been delivered for Temeraire's dinner. "Temeraire, be gentle with him," Lawrence said quietly. "Some dragons do not have very good understanding, like some people. You remember Bill Swallow on the Reliant." "Oh yes," Temeraire said equally low. "I understand now. I will be careful. Do you think he would like one of my cows?" "He's a kind dragon." "Would he care for something to eat?" Lawrence asked James, as they both dismounted and met on the ground. "Temeraire has already eaten this afternoon. He could spare a cow." "Why, that is very kind of you," James said, thawing visibly. "I am sure he would like it very much, wouldn't you, you bottomless pit?" he went on affectionately patting... Okay, at least it's affectionate. I was going to say, that's kind of messed up. Cows, Volatilis said, staring at them with wide eyes. Come and have some with me. We can eat over here, Temeraire said to the little gray, and sat up to snatch a pair of the cows over the wall of the pen. He laid them out in a clean, grassy part of the field, and Volatilis eagerly trotted over to share them with Temeraire when Temeraire beckoned. It is uncommonly generous of you, and him, James said, as Lawrence led him to the cottage. I've never seen one of the big ones share like that. What breed is he? I am not myself an expert, and he came to us without provenance, but Sir Edward Howe just today identified him as an imperial, Lawrence said, feeling a little embarrassed. It seemed like showing off, but of course it was just plain fact, and he could not avoid telling people. James stumbled over the threshold on the news and nearly fell into a Ferneo. Are you... Oh, Lord, you are not joking, he said, recovering and handing his leather coat off. But how did you find him, and what did you come to put him, and how did you come to put him in a harness? Lawrence himself would never have dreamed of interrogating a host in such a way, but he concealed his opinion of James's manners. The circumstances surely warranted some leeway. I will be happy to tell you, he said, showing the other man into the sitting room. I should like your advice, in fact, on how I am to proceed. Will you have some tea? Yes, although coffee if you have it, James said, pulling a chair closer to the fire. He sprawled into it with his legs slung over the arm. Damn, it's good to sit in for a minute. We have been in the air for 7 hours. 7 hours? You must be shattered, Lawrence said, startled. I had no idea they could stay aloft for that so long. Oh, bless you, I have been on 14-hour flights, James said. I shouldn't try it with yours, though. Volley can stay up beating his wings once an hour in fine weather. He yawned enormously. Still, it's no joke, not with the air currents over the ocean. Ferneo came in with coffee and tea, and once they were both served, Lawrence briefly described Temeraire's acquisition and harnessing for James, who listened in open amazement while drinking 5 cups of coffee and eating through 2 platefuls of sandwiches. So you see, I am at something of a loss. Admiral Croft has written a dispatch to the Corps at Gibraltar asking for instructions regarding my situation, which I trust you will carry. But I confess I would be grateful for some idea of what to expect, he finished. You're asking the wrong fellow, I'm afraid, James said cheerfully, draining a 6th cup. Never heard of anything like it, and I can't even give you advance warning about training. I was told off for the dispatch service by the time I was 12, and on volley by 14. You'll be doing heavy combat with your beauty, but, he added, I'll spare you any more waiting. I'll pop over to the landing grounds, get the post, and take your Admiral's dispatch over tonight. I shouldn't be surprised if you have a senior cap over to see you before dinner tomorrow. I beg your pardon? A senior what? Lawrence said, forced to ask in desperation. James's mode of speaking had grown steadily looser with the coffee he consumed. Senior captain, James said. He grinned, swung his leg down, and climbed out of the chair, standing up on his toes to stretch. You'll make an aviator. I almost forgot I'm not talking to one. Thank you. That is a handsome compliment, Lawrence said, though privately he wished James would have made more of an effort to remember. But surely you will not fly through the night. Of course, no need to lie about here, in this weather. That coffee has put the life back into me, and on a cow volley could fly to China and back, he said. We'll have a better berth over Gibraltar anyway. Off I go. And with this remark, he walked out of the sitting room and his own coat from the closet and strolled out the door whistling, while Lawrence hesitated, taken aback, and only belatedly went after him. Volley came bounding up to James with a couple of short, fluttering hops, babbling at him excitedly about cows and Temeraire, which was the best he could do at Temeraire's name. James petted him and climbed back up. Thanks again. We'll see you on my rounds if you do your training at Gibraltar, he said. Waved a hand, and with a flurry of gray wings, they were a quickly diminishing figure in the twilight sky. He was very happy to have the cow, Temeraire said after a moment, standing looking after them beside Lawrence. Lawrence laughed at this faint praise and reached up to scratch Temeraire's neck gently. I am sorry your first meeting with another dragon was not very auspicious, he said, but he and James will be taking Admiral Croft's message to Gibraltar for us, and in another day or two I expect you will be meeting more congenial minds. Oh, man. I might have to stop it here. I am a little fatigued. Where did I leave off? Yeah, right here. So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here. My throat is pretty strained right now, so we'll continue chapter 3.5, I guess, next Tuesday. Same time, around 7 o'clock probably, Pacific time, PM. But yeah, if anybody jumped in, I'm sorry I didn't notice. I'm just focused on these streams. I kind of focus on reading. I just kind of look down every now and then. And if you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for checking it out. So yeah, you guys have a great evening, great day, wherever you're at, whenever you're watching this.